So I have a confession. I am an absolute news junkie. As a political scientist, most people think that this is just part of my work, but it's far more than that. I absolutely, obsessively watch the news. Now, I'm also the child of news junkies. Growing up in my house, my parents hate sitcoms. There wasn't Frasier, it wasn't Cheers, it wasn't MASH on the television unless my dad got the remote for all of about 5 minutes. It was always the news. So as a child of the late 1980s and early 1990s in the US, this meant that every night I saw images from the former Soviet Union, Russia, states that I now consider to be the bread and butter of what I do every day. And part of the reason that I did it is because when I was growing up, I was told, this is a crisis. The world is in crisis because the Soviet Union is falling apart. Most people had no idea at the time that the Soviet Union actually would fall, and the question became, how did this happen? Once the Soviet Union had fallen and we had 15 new independent states, the question became, how can we solve this crisis? It's a crisis of transition, a crisis of development. But the question always came back, how can we solve it? When I was in high school and I started asking some of my teachers questions about the Soviet Union, questions about the things that had been in my face every day as a child, they tended to just point me in the direction of textbooks. And it was always about what I could find in the book. It's about history, or it's about the just plain old political system. But no one actually tried to answer the question for me. They just told me what it was. It happens because of X. There was no discussion of the process, no discussion of how we got from the 1970s to the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was no discussion of why some countries that came out of communism were succeeding and why others seemed to be failing. It was just, this is the answer. As I started going through my college studies, I kept coming back to it, because crisis is in the news every day. For those of you who pay attention to the news, this morning, there's a crisis in Iraq. There's a continued crisis in eastern Ukraine. There's a crisis in South Sudan. There's a global crisis in climate change. There's a global crisis due to food prices. There are crises everywhere. And every day, we talk about them in the news. But one of the things that we need to think about, and one of the problems that academics have, is that what pervades the airwaves and the bylines on the New York Times, the BBC, the Guardian today is rarely ever the same crisis that pervaded the airwaves and the bylines last month. We don't really think about crises in the long term because they tend to be informationally based. We see them, they're in our face for a short period of time. We ask the question, how did we get here? What can we do to solve it? And then when the next crisis comes around, we move on without really answering the previous question. We focus on what's in front of us. And frankly, this isn't something anybody should be surprised by. Crises get people passionate. They get people thinking. They're very emotional, which again tends to be a problem for most academics because we like objectivity. And objectivity is innately non-emotional. One of the other reasons why crises and this fast-paced news cycle create a problem for academics, particularly in their role as teachers, is because crises and the information that we're presented with tend to be very short-lived. Like I said, 1 week to 1 week, you can see different crises, and people care and get passionate and emotional about different things. But as academics and as lecturers or as teachers, we're supposed to be imparting long-term information. This is about big, overarching concepts. The research may change, some of the data may become new, but the overarching topic of what I teach in my classes is very little, there's not much difference between what I teach and what the concepts that would have been taught 10 years ago. We still know that we have to talk about electoral systems. I have to talk to my students about voter behavior. I have to talk to them about the difference between presidential and parliamentary politics. And then they stare at me blankly because they ask the same question. Why does any of this matter? This leads to one of the biggest crises that we have that isn't really talked about on the front page of the Financial Times or the New York Times, but it gets a lot of headway in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which most people probably don't read unless they're in higher ed. And that's the crisis of higher education. Information, most people know, because I'm sure every single one of you has come into contact with the internet at some point, if not in the last 24 hours, within the last week or so, at the very least within your lifetime. The internet has flattened information. It's called this democratization of information. Everybody can get a whole swath of information. And the problem that that presents to academics is that the job of an academic for most of the 20th century was to be an expert. What did we have that others didn't? We had expertise. We had a refined base of knowledge. We had information that other people couldn't get until they came to us. But now, the information is out there. I don't have to lecture my students about electoral systems because, frankly, if they want the information that I could give them in a basic lecture, they could just go on to a website. They could go on to any of the journals that are available. I tell them not to, but they could go on to Wikipedia. Not always trustworthy. Don't ever cite it if you're still a student. But they could get it. The information is there, and it's there for free. So the question in higher ed becomes, why do you pay for expertise? What do you pay for? What do we as academics provide you that you can't get for free somewhere else? A few years ago, a bigger threat came about for academics, and that was MOOCs. Large-scale online teaching for free. You can sit in your home in Dublin and watch a lecture series from an expert at Princeton for free. You can get an entire lecture series for free from top-flight academics. So the question again becomes, what are we as lecturers doing here? And even bigger than that, what is the point of a university? Personally, I tend to think that it goes back to one thing, and that's problem solving. What can we as lecturers, what can we as academics do for students? What can we do for anyone who wants to learn that they can't do sitting at home in front of a computer on their own? And that's that we can provide them with a space to explore, a space to experiment, and a safe space to fail. Students come into university with a lot of information, more than we've ever seen before. They are out there exploring every day. And frankly, for a political scientist like myself, they're coming in with a lot more information about all of the things that I should be teaching them. They're coming in with news cycles. They're coming in, going to the internet, and gathering information all the time. So I asked myself, when I first started teaching, what can I do that my really good lecturers did well, and what can I not do that my really bad ones did wrong? And the biggest thing that I learned is I can ask them questions. Asking questions provides far more of an education than providing answers ever will. Lectures, university used to be all about answers. They would look at a crisis, like my freshman year Introduction to International Affairs professor did. Great class, but I will never forget. It was said that it was a simulation-based studies model. So for a person like myself, an extrovert who loves group work, who loves working with other people, trying to come up with ideas, I loved it because it's simulation-based. You get into the nitty-gritty of it. The simulation was on the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was 2003. A simulation about a crisis that occurred 40 years ago isn't much of a simulation, and that's what I found. Maybe it was that I was too busy doing other things, but my lazy mind said, if I'm going to simulate the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm going to simulate it using the answer that proved to be right. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to look at the thousands of articles that have been written about it, and I'm going to say what they said. And if anybody questions why I say it, I'll just say, well, that's what so-and-so said in that article that was published in that journal. Peer-reviewed, done. The problem with that type of simulation isn't that it uses a crisis inappropriately, it's that it uses the wrong type of crisis. One of the best things about crisis as a tool for learning and teaching is that it presents us with a massive conundrum. And current crises provide us with unanswered conundrums. And when I thought about this, I decided to set myself a challenge. It was my first semester teaching, and I had all these grand ideas. And I said, I'm going to redesign the course I'm teaching entirely, and at the end, it's all going to be simulation-based learning. But I'm not going to tell them what simulation I'm going to do, because I'm going to wait. I want to see what crisis is really big at the time. Because that will mean a few things. One, it will mean that that crisis is in their face. It's not just me telling them about the crisis. It's them going home and hearing it on the radio. Even if they're not actively trying to think about the crisis, they can't avoid but think about it latently. It's comprehensive learning, all-encompassing learning at its best. And at the time, this was early to mid-2013, it was all about Syria. So I drew up all the papers, and for a class of about 350 students, I set them a task. I said, you each take on the role of a country in the UN. And you're all members of the UN Security Council. You all are parts of different delegations. It is your job to work with one another in your country delegations, and then to come into a massive session of the full Security Council and find a plausible solution to the crisis in Syria. I had a load of students immediately saying, just like, well, the solution that's necessary is there has to be military invasion. On the other side, I had students saying, absolutely no military invasion whatsoever. You cannot solve this crisis with military invasions. Then you had other students saying it has to be about sanctions. If you sanction them, we will solve all the crisis. And suddenly you had them all looking at each other going, well, I thought my idea was right. Why do you have a different idea? When you have an ongoing crisis, there is no realm of correct answers. Every answer has the possibility of being right. Every answer has the possibility of being wrong. And some of my colleagues said, not intentionally trying to be mean, they weren't calling students monkeys, but they asked me, don't you feel like you are actually just handing the zoo over to the animals? You're letting your students run the classroom. You are actually letting them get up. You're asking them to hold the mic, asking them to stand up on the dais and give a speech to the entire class. They're 18, 17 years old. Do you think they can actually handle this? And I said, of course they can. They're here to learn. If they can't handle this, how are we going to expect them to learn? Higher education needs to be about trust. And trust is all about giving students, giving ourselves, giving everyone the chance to explore, the chance to experiment, and the chance to fail, and to get up. Now, at the end of this, at the end of the simulation on Syria, one of the things that I liked best, I thought it was absolutely brilliant the way it worked out. All of our delegations worked together. Facebook groups were created. I had students begging me to figure out how to, rent out rooms in the library to come up with discussions. They were working on it outside class. I thought this was amazing, not only because they were actually taking it into their own hands, they were doing what nobody else trusted them to do. They were working on it. And then on the last day, we were getting ready to vote. They were so excited. They had this whole new, super watered down resolution that came to next to nothing, but they had it. And then we went to the vote, and the delegation from the United Kingdom walked up and vetoed. I thought it was brilliant. All of my students were destroyed. But but we had the solution. We worked it out. And what I said to them is, this is how crisis works. Crises are painful. Crises are emotive, and you always want to solve it. But in order to get there, we have to ask ourselves the question that everyone asks when they listen to the radio, when they watch TV, and when they read the newspaper: how did this happen? And then we have to try and answer the question, what can we do to make it stop? And when you use an ongoing crisis to teach students, what I've realized is that it gives them the opportunity to see education the way it should be. For a long time, education, especially higher education, was seen as a one-way street. I, lecturer, have expertise. That's why I did that whole PhD thing. That's why I'm called Dr. So-and-so. I'm not Dr. Baumann for no reason. You should listen to me. I have a PhD. I know all. But nowadays, I may know a lot about one thing, but I certainly don't know all. And frankly, I have learned so much from my students. Learning is not a one-way street. In fact, it's not a street at all. Learning is an open plane. It's an open space, and what it is filled with is the people who are there and all of the different things that they bring to it. And instead of thinking about higher education and our roles as student and lecturer as just that, I don't want to be a lecturer. I don't want to lecture people. I want to be a facilitator. I want to facilitate ideas. And above all, I want to facilitate exploration, experimentation, and potentially the failure that will allow students and will allow others to potentially find the solution that we really need to the crises that are out there in the world. Thank you very much.